My family ordered balloons, a cake, and called it a retirement send-off. They made me get up on stage and thank the younger generation. My son handed me an envelope with a cruise ticket and said, "Now you can finally just relax." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I knew. The papers were already signed at the notary's office. 60% of the shares were still mine, and they had just celebrated the retirement of the wrong woman. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Barbara Stone. I was 67 years old and the founder and CEO of Stonehall Logistics, a regional freight company based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I started it when I was in my late 20s with nothing but 2 delivery trucks, a rented garage, and a Rolodex full of small-town clients who trusted me to keep their shipments moving. I wore every hat back then: dispatcher, driver, accountant, mechanic, and marketer. I built the company the same way a woman builds a home after a storm, with her bare hands, her whole heart, and no time for fear. Over the decades, the company grew. By the time I was in my 50s, we had a fleet of over 70 trucks, contracts with 2 of the largest grocery chains in the Midwest, and a staff of nearly 100 employees. The business became the second heartbeat of my life, the first being my family. I always imagined the 2 would blend seamlessly. That was the dream anyway. I had 2 children, Brian and Lindsay. Both grew up around logistics talk and paperwork spread across the dinner table. Brian had a mind for numbers, always calculating things in his head, and Lindsay had a way with words and people that reminded me of myself when I was still knocking on warehouse doors trying to land our first big client. I never forced the business on them, but I hoped one day they'd want to step into it. I thought I was building something they could inherit, not just a company, but a legacy. When Brian finished business school, he asked if he could join the company as a junior analyst. I hired him with open arms. I didn't hand him a title or an office. He started in operations, just like everyone else. Lindsay joined a few years later, part-time at first, helping with branding and marketing. They worked hard, and I saw their potential. It gave me hope that Stonehall would remain a family company even when I decided to step back. At 65, I finally began talking about the idea of retirement. Not because I wanted to, but because people around me started hinting at it. Friends, accountants, and occasionally even Brian. He'd say things like, "You've earned your rest, Mom," or "Let us take the pressure off your shoulders." I didn't feel tired, but I thought maybe it was time to plan for a gradual exit. I started to pull back from some meetings, let them lead a few pitches, trusted them with decisions. I still held 60% of the stock and had final authority, but I wanted to believe they were ready to take on more. One morning, I was sitting at my favorite corner table at the local coffee shop, the Copper Cup, a small brick-walled spot near our main office. I came there often to review documents, away from the noise of the floor. I had my usual black coffee, 1 sugar, and a folder with our latest quarterly numbers. The numbers were decent, not record-breaking, but stable. Brian and Lindsay had recently pitched a series of digital transformations they believed would modernize our operations. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I had agreed to a trial. As I sifted through spreadsheets, I noticed a draft contract tucked into the back of the folder. It wasn't something I had added. It had my name on it, but the language was cold, unfamiliar, stripped of the personal tone I used in company documents. It was a proposal for a transition of majority ownership, a buyout plan, terms of a retirement settlement, structured payouts, a non-compete clause. I turned the pages slowly, reading every line. The contract assumed my agreement. It was written not as a discussion point, but as a foregone conclusion. The document wasn't signed, not by me, not yet, but it had clearly been prepared without my knowledge. Or perhaps they assumed I'd be flattered, grateful even to be freed of the company I had built. I sat with it for a long time. The coffee cooled. The noise of the shop faded into background static. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Betrayal wasn't the right word, not yet, but something close, something heavy. It wasn't the idea of stepping away that stung. I had known that day would come. It was how they had prepared for it, quietly, formally, without a real conversation. They had planned my exit like it was a formality, a shift in paperwork, a calendar event. They hadn't remembered what I remembered, that my signature wasn't a formality. It was power. It was ownership. It was the foundation under their feet. I slipped the contract back into the folder, placed my half-finished coffee into the trash, and left the cafe without a word. The bell above the door rang softly behind me. As I walked back to the office, the cool spring wind pressed against my coat, and my thoughts sharpened. They were planning my retirement, but they'd forgotten something critical. I still owned 60% of everything. The changes were subtle at first, easy to excuse, even easier to overlook if I hadn't spent most of my life reading between the lines of people's behavior. Brian started taking more meetings without me, not just the small ones, but the ones that used to be mine by default. Annual contracts, vendor negotiations, client reviews. Lindsay redesigned our website without running it by me, saying it was time to refresh the brand. My name disappeared from the leadership page entirely. When I asked about it, she gave me a tight smile and said it was just a temporary draft. Then came the seating shift. My office, the one I'd worked in since the early 2000s, with the big windows and the antique desk I refinished with my own hands, was being repurposed. According to Brian, they needed more space for the expanded IT team. He offered me a quiet spot near HR, far from the executive floor, where the real decisions were made. The desk they gave me was small and plastic. The chair squeaked when I sat down. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I thanked them politely and packed my things, but inside something tightened. Not in anger, not yet, but in recognition. I knew a slow push when I felt one. I'd used it myself in the early days of building the company, when I had to ease out unreliable partners or inefficient vendors. I knew how it worked, incremental, polite, and calculated. They weren't kicking me out. They were erasing me, one decision at a time. One day, I received a company-wide memo forwarded to me by a junior associate. It congratulated Brian and Lindsay on their strategic vision and welcomed the new leadership era. My name wasn't mentioned, not even in the footnotes. I stared at the email, reading it 3 times. Then I looked around the room, the pale beige walls, the humming fluorescent lights, the small desk where someone had left a jar of promotional pens. My world had shrunk, and they had done it with a smile. There was a meeting on the calendar that week, quarterly growth review. I showed up early, as I always did. When I entered the boardroom, no one acknowledged me, not rudely, not directly, just with a kind of ambient detachment, like I was a vendor or an observer. Brian stood at the front of the room, presenting a slideshow with charts and phrases like future-proofing and legacy handoff. At one point, he said, "As we transition toward a leaner, more agile structure, we're thankful for the solid foundation we inherited." That word, inherited, hung in the air like a balloon waiting to be popped. They clapped. Lindsay smiled at me across the table. Not a warm smile, not a daughter's smile, a strategic one, polished, rehearsed, and hollow. I nodded slightly, enough to be polite, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't thinking about their presentation. I was thinking about the shareholder agreement stored in my home safe, the one that listed me as the majority stakeholder, the one that required my approval for any structural changes above a certain financial threshold. They hadn't read it closely, or worse, they thought I wouldn't remember what it said. that I was just a tired old woman ready to hand over the reins for a thank you speech and a cruise voucher. They were wrong. The next morning, I walked into the office and noticed that my access badge didn't open the executive break room anymore. The code must have been changed. No announcement, no warning. Just another little message, tucked in digital form. This is no longer your space. I stood there for a moment, holding the badge in my hand. I heard laughter behind the frosted glass door, Brian's voice, Lindsay's laugh, then the beep of another badge being accepted, and the soft whoosh of the door opening for someone else. I didn't knock. I didn't ask. I turned around, went to my desk, and made a call. Not to HR, not to Brian, but to my lawyer. I told him to schedule a review of my shareholder rights and bring all the original formation documents. I told him I wanted a full breakdown of what I could legally enforce without notifying the current board. He asked if something had happened. I said no, not yet. The first thing I noticed was the color scheme. Soft lavender and pale gold. Not company colors. Not anything I would have chosen. Too delicate. Too staged. When I walked into the building that morning, the receptionist smiled a little too brightly and gestured toward the main conference room. I heard the faint echo of laughter and upbeat music coming from behind the closed doors. Something was off. Too many eyes followed me. Too many smiles that didn't reach the eyes. I paused at the door, hand resting on the handle, just long enough to draw one more breath. When I stepped in, the shout went up. Surprise! Dozens of faces turned toward me, some clapping, some cheering, a few already filming on their phones. The room had been decorated like a birthday party in a retirement home. Streamers, metallic balloons, a banner that read, "Congratulations, Barbara," in block letters. The playlist was full of 80s hits. On the table near the front, I saw a massive cake, tiered like a wedding display. It said, in frosted cursive, "Enjoy your next chapter." Brian stepped up with a microphone and that polished grin of his. He welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, said something about legacy, about vision, about pioneering spirit. I stood frozen near the door, my hands still at my sides, the corners of my mouth trying to lift out of sheer habit. I kept waiting for someone to make it clear. Was this a company anniversary? A milestone celebration? But no, Brian said it plainly a moment later. Today, we celebrate Mom's well-earned retirement from Stonehall. There it was, like a sudden shift in gravity. My fingers twitched, reaching for the folder I hadn't brought. My eyes scanned the room. Lindsay was in the front row, clapping with wide, glassy eyes. A few employees I'd known for over a decade looked at me and quickly looked away. I stood there while they played a slideshow of my years with the company. Old photos, me in front of our first 2 trucks, hair wild from wind, grease on my shirt, me at our first holiday party, me holding Brian as a toddler next to a shipping dock. People laughed and awed at the right times, but underneath the nostalgia, I felt a tightening in my chest, a quiet pressure, like I had been packaged for display, like I was already gone. After the slideshow, Brian invited me to the front. A chair had been set up beneath a balloon arch. I sat. There was a gift bag next to me. Inside was a set of travel guides, a leather-bound planner, and an envelope labeled, "For your next adventure." I opened it. Inside were cruise tickets, 2 weeks in the Caribbean, paid for, booked. He leaned into the mic and said, "You've earned your rest, Mom. Now let us take it from here." Applause again. I smiled because that was what I was expected to do. I looked out across the room, and for a moment it blurred, not from tears, but from the overwhelming clarity that none of this was about me. It was about optics. It was about moving on without resistance. It was about handing off the legacy without a fight. They hadn't asked me. They hadn't prepared me. They had decided, and beneath their polished intentions, I saw fear. Not fear of my health or my happiness, but fear of my control, of my presence, of the power I still held quietly in ink and numbers. They didn't understand that I didn't need the office or the nameplate or the balloons to remain relevant. I had structure, I had signatures, I had leverage. The rest of the event passed like a wedding where the bride had no say in the guest list. I posed for photos. I shook hands. I hugged employees who whispered kind things in my ear. But when the music rose and Brian toasted to the new era, I lifted my glass, looked straight at him, and raised my eyebrows ever so slightly. He blinked, just once, and I knew he'd felt it. That tiny crack in the narrative. They thought they'd thrown me a send-off, a ceremony to honor the past and step into the future. But they hadn't realized something simple, something irreversible. The future still legally belonged to me. I didn't go home after the party. I went to my lawyer's office. It was a brick building downtown, tucked between a notary and a bakery. I'd chosen it years ago for its unassuming appearance and the fact that it didn't have a glass lobby filled with overpriced furniture. My lawyer, Julia Chen, was practical, sharp, and allergic to small talk. She once told me she liked contracts more than people because they didn't lie. I respected that. She met me in her office, already sipping from a tall thermos of black tea. I handed her the folder with the unsigned buyout draft, the envelope from the cruise, and a printed copy of the corporate bylaws. I said nothing at first. I just watched her read. Her eyes moved quickly. She flagged a few pages with yellow tabs, murmured a few mms, then sat back in her chair and tapped the desk with her pen. "You still hold 60%, she said. "They can throw a party, but they can't restructure anything without your signature. They can't issue new stock. They can't change the executive board, not without your consent." That was all I needed to hear. We began drawing up documents that afternoon. The plan was simple but precise. I would reaffirm my status as majority stakeholder and file a motion to designate myself as interim CEO, citing the need for oversight during a strategic transition period. It sounded polite, neutral, necessary. It would not be permanent, just enough to put the brakes on any plans they had made behind my back. Julia drafted the paperwork with surgical precision. Every clause had a purpose. Every line was a thread meant to pull their intentions loose at the seams. I wasn't going to confront them emotionally. I wasn't going to raise my voice or demand an apology. I was going to do what I'd always done: work the details, use the paper. I returned to my apartment late that evening and opened the old filing cabinet in my closet. It held decades of documents, partnership agreements, payroll ledgers, tax returns, and meeting notes scribbled on legal pads. I flipped through folders until I found what I was looking for: the original shareholder agreement from 1994 and the amendment from 2008 when Lindsay joined the board. My name, my rights, in black ink, witnessed and notarized. I laid them out across the dining table like a map they never expected me to revisit. Over the next week, Julia filed the documents with the state and informed the board of my motion. I didn't tell Brian or Lindsay in person. I wanted them to receive the notice through proper channels, the same way I'd received the retirement draft. Meanwhile, I returned to the office. I didn't ask permission. I used my keys. My badge had been reactivated after a call to the building's security company, still under contract through the old system, the one I had put in place. No one greeted me when I walked in. A few employees looked surprised. One of the warehouse managers gave me a nod. That was enough. I didn't take my old office back. I sat in an unused conference room, one with a door that closed and blinds that still worked. I brought my laptop, a stack of files, and a pot of coffee from home. I didn't need a title on the door. I had one on the papers. Brian stormed in on the third day. He was holding the motion letter, already crumpled at the edges. He paced. He asked questions. He accused. He tried to reason. I didn't answer. I pointed to the chair across from me and waited until he sat. Then I pulled out the updated shareholder ledger and pointed to the percentages. 60% under my name. The rest divided between him, Lindsay, and a handful of silent investors. I showed him the clause requiring supermajority approval for structural changes, leadership transitions, and capital reallocation. I could see the moment it hit him, not just the words, but what they meant. I told him the company wasn't being taken away from him, but it wasn't being taken from me either. Not by surprise, not by party, not by assumption. That afternoon, I emailed the full staff with a brief update. I said I would be stepping in temporarily to ensure stability during this phase. I acknowledged the excitement around new ideas, but reminded everyone of the values on which Stonehall had been built: respect, responsibility, and transparency. I didn't use words like return or retake. I wasn't trying to relive the past. I was anchoring the present. That night, I went for a long walk. The air was cold and the streets were quiet. I stopped by a bench near the river, the same place I used to take Brian as a toddler when I needed 5 minutes of quiet between double shifts. I watched the water move slowly, steadily. They had tried to write me out of the story, but I still held the pen, and now I was writing the next chapter in permanent ink. I arrived at the office before the sun came up. The parking lot was still mostly empty, only a few early deliveries humming in the loading bay. I unlocked the side door with the key card Julia had helped reinstate. No fanfare, no announcement, just the soft click of recognition as the system let me back in. Inside, everything looked the same and entirely different. The walls still bore the framed mission statements I had written years ago, but the energy had shifted. I could feel it in the way people glanced up when I passed. Brief, curious, cautious, not hostile, not welcoming, just waiting. I didn't reclaim my old office. That would have sent the wrong message. Instead, I chose a smaller one near the operations wing. It used to be the customer service manager's space before we consolidated. I wiped the dust from the desk myself, plugged in a loaner laptop, and opened a fresh notepad. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of power. I didn't need them. The authority wasn't in my tone, it was in the numbers, and those had never stopped belonging to me. I started by requesting the full financials from the last 2 quarters. Not the summaries they sent to investors, but the real reports, the ones with footnotes, inconsistencies, and warnings tucked in margins. I went line by line through vendor contracts, delivery logs, payroll adjustments, software subscriptions. Within the first 2 days, I found 6 redundant platforms that had ballooned our monthly tech expenses, and a warehouse software suite that had been billed for custom development features we never implemented. The operations team noticed. They didn't say anything directly, but by the end of the week, I had 3 different department heads stop by with questions that sounded like small talk but were really feelers. Were you staying long? Were you replacing anyone? Should we wait to finalize that order? I gave calm, measured answers. I wasn't there to cause fear. I was there to restore structure. Brian stayed mostly quiet during that first week. He showed up late to 2 of the meetings I called and left early from another. When he did speak, his tone was clipped, his smile forced. Lindsay was more careful, offering updates, volunteering information, occasionally trying to soften the room with jokes that landed flat. I let them talk. I didn't push. I watched how they handled pressure when it was clear someone was watching. By the second week, I requested a staff performance audit, not to punish anyone, but to understand what had shifted. Several employees had been moved into roles they weren't trained for. 2 seasoned drivers had quietly quit and hadn't been replaced. A mid-level manager had implemented a bonus structure that incentivized speed over accuracy, leading to a spike in delivery complaints. I didn't discipline anyone. I created a task force. I assigned experienced employees to mentor the newer ones. I restructured reporting lines to ensure accountability. Quiet changes, no threats, just a gentle realignment toward order. People started knocking on my door more often, not with fear, but with relief. They brought questions, suggestions, old problems that had gone ignored. I listened. I wrote things down. I followed up. I began holding Monday check-ins. Not mandatory, not formal. Just coffee, updates, priorities. The first one had 6 people. The second, 14. By the third week, we had to move it to the larger break room. No one clapped when I entered. No one toasted me or called me visionary. But the room was full. The energy was steady. People were showing up because they felt seen again. One afternoon, I walked past the main conference room and noticed a whiteboard left uncovered. Someone had written Q3 vision planning across the top. Below it, in red marker, was a list of slogans. Fresh blood, fresh brand. New era thinking. Rewrite the rules. I took a photo and erased it, not out of spite, out of clarity. We didn't need slogans, we needed structure. We needed to remember who we were before buzzwords made us forget. That evening, I sat in my car in the lot long after everyone else had gone home. I didn't turn on the radio. I just watched the lights in the windows dim one by one, like stars setting for the night. This wasn't a takeover. This wasn't revenge. This was leadership. Leadership without applause, strategy without fireworks. And I was exactly where I needed to be. It started with a knock on the door, not the polite kind, the rushed, urgent, overconfident kind. I had been expecting it. Brian stepped into my office without waiting for an invitation. He wore the navy suit I bought him after his first internship, now tailored, modern, a little too tight across the shoulders. His tie was perfectly knotted, but his face betrayed him. Tight jaw, flared nostrils, a faint sheen of sweat above his upper lip. He closed the door behind him with more force than necessary and stood across from my desk, hands clenched at his sides. I didn't offer him a seat. He didn't ask. He started talking fast, words stacked on top of each other. Confusion, concern, disbelief. He said no one had told him I was returning in any official capacity, that the team was shaken, that my reappearance had disrupted workflow. He asked what my long-term intentions were and whether I understood the position this puts us in. I listened, not nodding, not frowning, just watching. His voice wavered when he tried to regain control of the conversation. I saw it happen, the realization that the fear he felt wasn't about me as his mother. It was about me as the majority shareholder. It was about the paper, the bylaws, the clauses. It was about what he'd forgotten to check before planning my exit. I handed him a folder. Inside were 3 documents. The first was the shareholder reaffirmation, stamped, notarized, and already in effect. The second was the interim CEO motion, legally binding until the board voted otherwise, which, under the supermajority clause, they could not do without me. The third was a memo detailing a full audit of strategic expenditures made in the last fiscal year. He didn't touch the papers. He looked at them like they might bite him. For a moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. The kind of fear that comes from thinking you're the future and realizing the foundation still belongs to someone else. He finally sat down, slowly, as if gravity had just returned to the room. He tried a softer tone. He said things like, "We were trying to protect your legacy, and we thought it was time." He used phrases like natural progression and generational shift. I let him talk, let him spiral. Let the tie choke a little tighter around his throat. When he was done, I told him I hadn't come back to hold on to power. I came back because they were careless with it. I told him that ownership wasn't symbolic, that equity wasn't ceremonial, that I didn't build this company to hand it over like a slice of cake at a party. I reminded him that leadership wasn't a suit and a slide deck. It was accountability. It was knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to expand and when to stabilize. He sat quietly for the first time since entering the room. I didn't ask if he understood. I didn't need to. The next day, Lindsay came to see me. She didn't knock either, but her energy was different, measured, cautious, searching. She didn't wear a smile. She didn't wear defiance, just silence. She sat down without speaking and looked at me like someone realizing a chapter had closed before she finished reading. She asked if I hated them. I said no. I said I was disappointed. That was worse. She didn't argue. I slid another folder across the table. This one held a new plan, restructuring not for retaliation, but sustainability, a shared future if they were ready to treat it like one. She read quietly, page by page, her hands trembling just slightly. They both came to the staff meeting that Friday. They sat near the middle of the room, not at the front. They didn't speak. They listened. People noticed. People whispered. No one laughed. That afternoon, Brian sent me a message, just a single sentence. Let me know when you're ready to talk succession for real. I didn't reply right away. I stood by the window of my office, looking down at the trucks being loaded, the warehouse crew moving with purpose, the hum of a business that was still alive. The fear in his tie had spoken louder than all his words. And now, for the first time, he was ready to hear mine. I began spending fewer hours in the office, not because I was retreating, but because I had regained what mattered: control, clarity, voice. I no longer needed to hover to be heard. My presence had returned to the company's bloodstream like oxygen, unseen but essential. Most mornings I arrived early, stayed through the first half of the day, and left by early afternoon. I took calls from my front porch, ran numbers from my kitchen table, and read through reports with a thermos of tea at the city park. My laptop followed me like an old companion. I found that ideas came easier in open air. The wind carried the noise away and left behind only what was useful. I started holding mobile meetings, unofficial, off-the-calendar conversations with employees outside the walls of the building. Sometimes it was lunch at the food truck near the shipping yard. Sometimes a coffee walk around the block. No PowerPoint, no whiteboards, just truth. People told me more in 20 minutes outdoors than they ever did in the conference room. Maybe it was the breeze. Maybe it was the lack of walls. It was in those quiet, honest moments that I saw what needed fixing. Not numbers, not logistics, but trust. The staff had adapted to the changes, but they hadn't felt anchored. They were waiting for something steady, something that didn't change with every press release or management buzzword. They didn't need revolution. They needed reassurance. So I gave it to them, not with promises, but with consistency. I answered emails quickly. I kept my word. I remembered names and birthdays and small victories that went unnoticed in spreadsheets. I asked questions without a hidden agenda. I let silence fill the spaces between updates so people could speak if they wanted to. I began mentoring again, quietly. A few of the younger employees asked for guidance, especially the ones who had joined during the chaos. They wanted to understand the roots of the company, not just how it ran, but why it mattered. I told them about the early days, the nights when I slept in the office because we couldn't afford hotel rooms during long hauls, the day we signed our first six-figure contract and I cried in the break room because I finally felt like a real businesswoman. They listened like it mattered, because it did. I invited Brian to one of these mobile meetings. Just a walk, no agenda. He was stiff at first, unsure if it was a test. But by the third block, his shoulders loosened. He asked about our original routes, the old trucks we'd named after relatives. He smiled when I told him the story about the time I had to deliver freight in a snowstorm with no chains and a flat tire. He asked what I wanted to happen next. I said I wanted him to earn it, not inherit it, not assume it, earn it by showing up, by listening, by making the business better, not just bigger. He nodded. For once, no counter-argument, just air between us, shared but not strained. Later that week, I reviewed a proposal he submitted on his own. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful, grounded. I saw the beginning of the leader he still had the chance to become. Lindsay, too, had begun recalibrating. She no longer pitched cosmetic changes without a strategy. She sat through meetings with a notebook instead of a tablet. She started asking for feedback, not just approval. I saw glimpses of the woman I'd hoped she'd become, sharp but rooted. One breezy Thursday afternoon, I stood on the rooftop deck we rarely used, overlooking the parking lot and the warehouse yard. Trucks rolled in and out like clockwork. Forklifts moved with practiced ease. The sound of engines blended with the wind. There was something sacred about that rhythm. I pulled out my phone and opened a draft message to the board. I began outlining a future transition plan, structured, deliberate, generous, a gradual path forward with checks and balances, a map for letting go with dignity, not silence. But I didn't send it yet. I saved it. I wanted to feel the wind a little longer. I wanted to stay on the rooftop just a few more minutes, breathing in the scent of diesel and dust and distant blossoms. This place had been my life for so long, and now it could be something more, a place that grew beyond me without erasing me. There would be no curtain call, no plaque or portrait, just a steady exit. But not today. Today I had one more meeting. With the wind, the envelope was thick, cream-colored, and hand-delivered. No postage, no impersonal barcode, just my name, written in careful ink across the front. It sat on my desk for an hour before I opened it. I had a sense of what it was, and I wanted to sit with the weight of it a while longer before I confirmed it. Inside was a formal proposal, not a surprise, not a ploy, a real professional document. Brian and Lindsay had written it together. Their names appeared at the top of the cover letter, side by side, for the first time in any official capacity. They thanked me, not with inflated language or guilt-laced sentiment, but with sincerity. They acknowledged the mistakes, the assumptions, and most importantly, the lesson they had finally learned, that leadership is not claimed by age or inheritance, but by trust. They proposed a gradual transition of executive duties with clear benchmarks and time frames. They asked me to remain on the board as chair. They even included a clause stating that no significant decisions could be made without my consultation until the transition was complete. It was everything I had hoped for, measured, respectful, legal, and earned. But what stood out most was a section near the end, a proposal, not for me to step down completely, but to use my experience in a new role, an internal mentor and external advisor for client relations, legacy partnerships, and new community initiatives. They wanted me involved, not as a figurehead, but as a resource, a presence, a guiding voice. At the bottom was the line for my signature. I set the folder aside and looked out the window. The sun was just starting to lower behind the line of delivery trucks. Golden light spilled across the pavement. The trees along the edge of the lot were full now, branches dancing in the wind like hands waving towards something better. I stood and walked to the window, resting my palm against the cool glass. I remembered signing my first business license at a laminate table in a strip mall 20 miles from here. I remembered the way my hand shook, not from fear, but from knowing how much depended on that ink. Over the years, I signed hundreds of documents, leases, vendor contracts, employee checks, insurance forms. each one a small act of direction, a subtle steering of the wheel. This one was different. This one was release, but not retreat. I didn't feel erased. I felt elevated. That night, I took the proposal home. I sat at the kitchen table where I had once sorted delivery invoices between dinner and bedtime. I read it again, slowly, line by line. Then I picked up my pen, and I signed, upward. I curved my name just slightly higher than I usually did. Not on purpose, just instinct. A small rise in the arc, like a bird lifting off the edge of a branch. I dated it. I closed the folder, and I breathed. Not a sigh, but a full breath, steady and clear. The next morning, I returned the envelope to the office myself. No assistant, no courier. I handed it directly to Brian, who stood when he saw me coming. He took it with both hands and didn't speak right away. He just nodded, his eyes flicking toward the signature line before meeting mine. He said thank you, not with fear, not with formality, with respect. I nodded back. Afterward, I went up to the rooftop. The breeze was waiting. The noise of the warehouse below was steady, predictable, like a heartbeat you don't notice until you try to leave it behind. I sat for a while, watching the trucks move in and out of the yard, their paths precise and familiar. A system I had built, a rhythm I had kept. Now it would go on without me, but not without my name, not without my voice written into its walls, not without a signature that pointed forward and slightly upward. Later that week, I visited the Community Foundation building downtown, where I had arranged to set up a small business mentorship fund under my name. A portion of my shares, converted into equity dividends, would finance workshops, scholarships, and consulting for women over 50 launching late-stage ventures. I called it the Second Start Fund. I imagined a woman like me, sitting at her kitchen table with a dream and a spreadsheet, needing someone to tell her that she wasn't too old, too late, or too tired. She wouldn't have to build alone, and neither would I. I had plans now, not for scaling fleets, but for scaling impact, not for growing margins, but for growing people. Because when I finally stepped back, it wouldn't be down, it would be forward. And everything about that signature, soft, rising, and sure, said exactly that.